Hey everybody, Big Toad here and welcome to my studio. Today we're going to be working on a new pond painting with lily pads and some cattails. And it'll be similar to the last pond I did, but a new take, a new perspective, and I think a better composition. So here are my pond sketches that I did up. I liked the second one I did, which is the top right, and I liked the third one I did, which is the bottom left. Now, I brought these right out of my memory from my childhood, not direct copies, but illustrations of what I felt and did as a child running around these ponds when I was 10, 12 years old. So I did the upper right pond already. And in doing that, I had a lot of fun. And then I realized that the lower left pond would actually make a better composition. So I'm going to dive right into that. I will be doing this painting on an 11 by 14 canvas board. And I start, as always, with my sketch in. And I like to use typically a burnt sienna, thinned down, and I do use my turpentine or turpentine substitute to thin it out. And that does help the outline dry faster, which is one of the things I'm after. And it's a natural color, the burnt sienna, so it works really well. As you can see, I sketch in the fence posts and the trees and the bank around the pond. I'm sketching in these crooked trees, and I am using my sketch that I did in my notebook as a reference. And I'm shading in the trees a little bit to show the shadow. And this is going to be a bush there that I just put in. So you can see the little dots I put into the pond where the lily pad section is going to go, and then the lines going up in the bottom right that are going to be where the cattails grow. And that finishes up the sketching. My next step is to do my block in. And I have posted my palette colors that I use. It's pretty typical of what I use in most of my paintings. I do bring in different colors from time to time as needed, but I'll let you know in the video when I do that. Otherwise, those are the ones I use. Now, the blue sky that I'm putting in is a little darker probably than I need. I did mix that with ultramarine blue and, of course, titanium white. And then I did gray it down with, honestly, I'm not even sure what I grayed it down with. I've still got paint on my palette from when I did my last painting. So I just used some leftovers there that were already some blues and grays that I had. But probably I used colors such as yellow and red tones, maybe burnt sienna, a little dab of that to gray it out. So it's a little darker than I need, and I'll go back in and I will lighten that up. I also use that same sky color to block in my pond. Typically, the water reflects the color that's in the sky, so they complement each other. So just take it from the sky right down to the water to just get that blocked in real quick. You will see that I'm using a brush that's too small, which I complain about while I'm doing this, but I just didn't want to dirty my bigger brush. And you'll also see that as I get over to the cattails and the lily pads that it does bleed over. It wasn't quite dry. My sketching wasn't dry, so it does bleed over. But knowing I have to go in with other colors, it's not a big deal. Also, I have to show reflection. And then I move to the trees, and I use a very dark bluish green. So I will make my green out of, the best way to make a natural green is your ultramarine blue and mixed in with your yellow ochre. That produces a really nice dark green. And then I do lighten that up with some titanium white to make this color back there. And I fiddle around with titanium white, adding a little bit more of that and the blue until I get just the right blue color I want. And that blue color would be just a bluish green. And I'll fiddle around with some bluish greens in there to finish it off. The block in is not a high skill type painting, so I'm going to keep the speeds up a little higher to get through it quicker. I go straight with a yellow ochre for my block in of the ground itself. And I do that because yellow ochre is one of the base colors I use throughout the painting, especially in the ground cover for the grasses and such as that. So it makes sense to use a color that's going to, if you do see through it, it's a natural color that you're going to see in your landscape. So like the sky and the pond, even though it's darker, if some of that shows through, it's just going to add variety and real life to the painting if it does show through. So, and that's why I'm using the yellow ochre on the ground cover. As you see, I just use a white gessoed canvas board, and I don't typically tint the board at all before I start painting. I use the block in to do that, and I block in pretty thoroughly. And I'm not, I don't avoid wet paint. I paint wet on wet the majority of the time, so it works out just great for me. I'm going to come in now and block in the trees. And one of the best, really dark, rich greens is made from ultramarine blue and yellow ochre. Give those two a try and make your greens. Greens can be very tough because if you start with like a cadmium red light and a cadmium yellow light, you're going to get these vibrant greens that they're just not abundant in nature. They're there as highlights. They're there where the sun shines. But if you try to block in with them or use them a lot, they're just going to just make your painting look neon. But try the ultramarine blue and ultramarine blue and yellow ochre. Make your good pile of nice dark green, and you can lean it towards bluish by adding extra blue, or let it fade a little bit more towards the yellowish by not using as much blue. But experiment with it back and forth, and then start adding in titanium white to reduce its vibrancy and make a less dark green. And then try adding in some, take a little bit of pile and add in just a touch of yellow, cadmium yellow medium, see what that looks like, cadmium yellow light, see what that looks like, and experiment with these colors. And you begin to see how you can make all these different greens really easy just with those colors, and just by starting out with ultramarine blue and yellow ochre. Really good natural dark greens. You'll see I don't cover the trees completely with the green. I do leave some sky holes where I might utilize those later to let the background, the blue sky, or the far distant trees to bleed through or poke through the leaves of the front trees. So I brought the speed down to normal, because you'll see that I've gone in for this bush and went with a lighter green, a little more yellowish green. And I'm also going to use that on the sunny side of the trees. And I'm going to go ahead and start putting some different colors in those trees, because I wanted the bush to come out a little different color than the main tree. So I mixed up that yellowish green for the bush. And then I said, well, why don't I go ahead and put that on the sunny side of the trees as well, because I know I'm going to need it there. And I'm not being real careful at this point with my brush strokes or anything like that. This is just getting paint down and getting it down fast. And when you're at the block in stage, even if you do get into some detail like this, it's not permanent. So, and get it done quick. I'm also going to come in here with some darker green to add some more depth and contour to the trees and the bush. Again, stepping out a little bit from the block in mode into the actual painting mode. I had the colors already on my palette mixed up, so I went ahead and did that. And so I'm putting some dark green on the shaded side of the bush. Not being real careful with the strokes, just some random strokes there. And now I'm going to put that same darker green into the tree. It's a little more green than the original block-in green, so it's a slightly different value, a little more chroma to it. In other words, it's gonna seem a little brighter. And so I just roughen in that green tones in there, not really calling it done, but I don't know, it gives me a good base, and it'll help me when I'm moving forward, I think, to spring some other color ideas off of. So at this point, what's left is blocking in the stones and the fence posts. So I start with a gray on the fence posts. When you're dealing with old wooden fence posts that have been out in the weather, they're going to have a lot of grays in them. They're going to have some uh, dark grays, maybe even a couple specks of black on the shadowed side. You'll find sometimes that the fence posts have been burnt by a fire, and so they'll be charred on one side or the other. And I'm using that same color on this big rock that's going to anchor this bottom left corner. So, and I can go ahead and touch in and put in a few rocks with that same gray, kind of block those in the process. Not on my sketch, but just where I feel like I can use them. And I can always cover those up later. Again, it's not a big deal, but I wanted to use that gray. I knew I wanted some rocks in there to create some randomness to the landscape. So with my blocking basically done, I'm going to be moving to the landscape, the hillside around the pond, and I'm going to be using more of an impasto technique. It's really the technique I just truly enjoy painting in. I leave larger amounts of paint showing the brush strokes. I think the brush strokes just bring vitality to the painting and life to the hillsides and things I use it on. I don't use the same brush strokes for like the hillside that I might for the trees or the water, and I will vary the amount of paint I use using the impasto technique in different locations. Part of this style of painting for me includes varying the shades or the colors that I put down. So I'll do at least 3 different paint colors that I'm putting down, hues that go down, all very similar, but they vary somewhat in hue, they vary somewhat in intensity, they vary somewhat in chroma. So it creates that fluctuating, that vitality to the landscape, as if it's alive, and maybe a breeze going over the grasses, or this, carrying some dust. And because I use the impasto technique, leaving these brush strokes, leaving the larger amounts of paint on the canvas, as you move around the painting physically, it changes. Texture begins to change, and every view and how the light hits it alters what you're seeing and how you're seeing the colors, how you're seeing the vibrancy. And so the painting feels like it's actually coming alive. For this painting in the ground, I think I am using about 4, maybe 5 different hues that are all very similar based in yellow ochre, give me that grass look. And I do use straight yellow ochre, and then I'll blend in some. For one pile, I'll use straight yellow ochre. For another color, I will use yellow ochre with some white titanium in it. I will bring in some cadmium yellow light and cadmium yellow medium into a couple to alter the colors a little bit. And I can also deaden one down a little bit with some burnt sienna. And so by using this variety, it really creates vitality in the landscape. Some things to note is that in my focal area, I will use smaller brushstrokes, not as long. And that is to create the illusion of detail, a stronger illusion of detail around that focal area, and the eye will travel to that. And whether the viewer recognizes it or not, they will focus more on that area and hold them into the painting there.
As I move away from the focal area, I tend to start to lengthen out my brush strokes. And again, that creates that smoother transition into the focal area. The brush strokes themselves tend to lead you towards the focal area. And that's a technique I try to incorporate into my paintings, sometimes more effectively than others just because of the composition. So it's just something I'm always looking to do, is alter the length and size of the brush strokes to complement the painting in various ways. One, the focal area. Two, to help the eye travel towards the focal area, direct the eye. Three, I would use brush strokes to emphasize the contours of the surfaces I'm painting on, and also to create vitality in a surface. So brushstrokes, you begin to think about them in multiple ways. The brushstroke itself becomes just as much of the art as the hues that you put down, as the composition that you're painting, and they can become very important, which to me is very comforting and feels good. And I like the method. I like the amount of paint. And in saying all that, it's important to also note that variety in the brush strokes is just as critical. So while I say I make smaller brush strokes, I don't try to make them all the same size. And when I transition to the larger brush strokes, I try to make the transition smooth and varied so that the eye doesn't notice that there's some kind of break in the brush strokes or the method. So I slowly grow them out and randomly. So there's got to be randomness to the brush strokes as well. Even though I'm maybe working on the contour of this hillside, I don't line up all my brush strokes just the same and make them look like lining up my toy cars as a child. And so learning an impasto approach and emphasizing brushstrokes, I think it's fun. It's fulfilling. There's a lot to think about, but it becomes second nature as you do it. And for me, it really didn't take long for it to become second nature. I think I still have room to improve. There's still better ways and better methods that I need to learn and incorporate. But this impasto approach is just beautiful and very relaxing for me. So the focal area in this painting is right where I've been working, and I usually start there. The impasto small brush strokes get me in the mindset to paint. It kind of just washes away the stress of the day and whatever difficulties I'm having. I think it's soothing. So that's where I started in order to incorporate those small brush strokes. So that makes the trunks of these trees extremely important in the focal area, as well as the ground around the trees and over to the two fence posts there on the ground. So I will put some care into the tree trunks, those two tree trunks, and into those fence posts and any ground cover that I will add on top of this ground cover I'm putting in. So while this base is impasto and it provides so much of that detail for the eye to travel about your painting and to focus on, I will go over the top of it in places to create some interesting things for the eye to settle on, for the viewer to see and to travel between. So I'll put some greenish ground cover in there and maybe a few little flowers growing in it, and create some more contour and shape and reality, vitality to the painting right over the impasto. And impasto means I'm not blending my colors. I'm allowing the various hues and shades to go down in these brushstrokes randomly around each other and create this changes rather than force the changes through blending of colors. I don't really like blending. I don't know, some people do a beautiful job of it, so I'm not against blending at all, just like I'm not against other methods of painting besides this impasto approach that I take. It's just a style that I've settled on and found to be rewarding. You may have noticed at this point that I've moved away from the point of interest, and some of my brush strokes are getting longer, covering more canvas with each stroke. Maintain that randomness of stroke and randomness of color in order to create this ground cover. That's important. As I've mentioned before, you don't want to line up a bunch of colors or line up a bunch of brush strokes. So, and I'll do a final review, and I'll review all the way through it to work on those brush strokes. Make sure if I find some that are too lined up, I change them. We just get into the sometimes human brain likes things lined up, so we line them up. Likes things to be uniform, so we make them uniform. And so we as artists have to naturally look for those things and undo them. So I mix out all my ground colors. Like I said, I think it's 4 or 5 here. So I have a big pile of each, so I can just dip into them. While I'm doing this, I'm not cleaning my brush, and I just let the colors just settle onto, the brush and dip into them. And I don't typically concern myself with cleaning or even wiping down the brush when I'm at this point in a painting, using the assortment of colors for a particular area, like the ground. I just let the natural course of picking up paint and putting it down do its job. Allow that brush to do its job. Allow that paint to do its job, and rely less on some skill that I might have. You'll notice I left a little bit of ground around the pond where I didn't put any paint down. That's because I'm going to come in here in a second in the video and start applying some mud or moist earth around it. And I'm going to use, basically, it's going to be burnt sienna. I'm going to use a lighter version of burnt sienna and then a dark one. Start out with the dark and realize I need to come in with a light. So there's a watered down, I say watered down, I put titanium white into that to bring up the damp soil to the edge. And then I'm going to come back in and start touching it up with straight burnt sienna right next to the shoreline to get the appearance of some mud of varying degrees of wetness. I'm bringing that paint down into the water and pushing it up into the ground cover. And as you'll notice, I'm not creating mud. It's because I've got a good load of paint on my brush, and I can dab it and tap it right over the top of that ground cover paint I've used. And works very effectively. If you don't go in there with enough paint, though, you're going to start smudging it instead of painting, and you're going to you have the risk of creating mud. So it's about keeping that brush loaded with some nice creamy paint. If the paint is too runny, it won't stack up for you properly, and you won't be able to maintain your brush strokes, and it'll just, it just won't look right. And if the paint is too stiff, it's not going to come off the brush well, and it's going to, again, you risk creating mud, and you start smudging rather than painting. So that paint's it's gotta be the right consistency, and it's not that difficult. It's important, but it's not that difficult. You'll quickly, within the first stroke or two, notice, all right, this is too thick. So add some thinner to it. And when I say thinner, I'm talking some kind of thinning substance. I typically just use linseed oil to get the consistency of the paint if it's not quite as buttery as it needs to be. And you want that paint to just settle on top of each other. You don't want to drag it around with another glob of paint on your brush. Remember to keep the lines inconsistent around the edges. The mud's not going to be a straight pattern, so some of the mud's going to come up further and some of it's going to come down less. And I can come back in and paint back down into it with my ground cover if it looks too consistent, or if I need to break up some of the monotony of that shoreline at all. I'm getting ready to now move into using the straight burnt sienna, and I think this is about as close as I get to blending. is when I start doing this kind of thing, where I'm tapping, lightly on the paint with that burnt sienna, and then I'm moving that around a little bit. I don't, it's not really blending as much as it is kind of allowing the paint to mix and clump up together. I want to create variations in that color, lighter and darker. If I leave a little dark stuff here and there, that's going to look natural and fine. So I'm not looking for a smooth look all the way around. I'm going to push the darker burnt sienna up higher in some locations, leave it lower in others, allow it to accumulate and be in its darker form in some spots, just to create variety in that shoreline, as a natural shoreline would be. So you'll see I'll start leaving darker streaks here soon, and those will look nice. You've probably noticed in my paintings that I also like bright contrast and bright colors. I just can't help it. It's how I enjoy painting. I'm not a real stickler about getting matching the colors or the hues, the brightness of the photo I'm working from, as much as I am capturing the essence of it. And I'm not even working off a photo here. This is all coming out of my own brain, my own mind. Like I said before, drawing from my past as a youth, playing around the ponds of Missouri. Slowing down the video again here so you can kind of watch the technique as I push this paint around. Again, coming in straight burnt sienna and allowing it to naturally just happen what happens, allowing the paint and the brush strokes to create randomness. It's important to maintain randomness in nature. So again, I go back in there. You can see I add a little darker strip of burnt sienna to create, again, keep that natural look. Burnt sienna, the darker, would represent where the dirt is more moist. So that would be closer to the pond's water line. For the sake of time, I'll speed this back up again as I finish the shoreline. Randomness. Really only two colors I'm using here. The weakened burnt sienna that I put white titanium in, or titanium white in, to make that softer color. I put that around the pond, and then I've come back in here with straight burnt sienna and just touching it in. I think it looks pretty nice. Could have maybe, experiment with different colors. And I'm not trying to create a realism type painting as much as I am something that expresses how I remember and feel this. And so there'll be some pieces of it that maybe lean more towards realism than others, and some of it is more impressionistic. And I'm not trying to force myself into anything like that as much as I am to just create my style. Now I'm moving into the rocks. I've got a couple different tones. Basically, rocks are going to start off with three tones. You've got a dark tone, a medium tone, and a light tone. And the dark tone goes where the shadow is. The medium tone goes or usually on the side, and the light tone will go on top where the sun is shining. And that's just a great first start when doing rocks, is start off with three tones and then come back in and incorporate some variety, and maybe bring in the sky color or the ground color, or highlights of blue here or there. There's ways you can dress up your rocks more than just the three tones. On the back side of the pond, we have this pile of rocks, and that can be the most difficult to do. It's easy to do one rock or two rocks or three rocks, but when you get a clump of rocks, it gets a little harder because you have to use values of these colors to separate the rocks. I'll slow down the video a little bit as I start bringing in the darker rock color, and you'll see I'm putting it on the shady side of the rock, the sun's coming from the left. Now I'm going, trying to go in along the lower edge of this rock and again create shadows, and the variations in the color of the rocks can be shadows, and it can actually be the material in the rocks. So it's not like painting a ball where you always know that it's one color and a smooth surface. It's more complicated than that to put the shadows and the variations in colors in, because it's more than the change in the rock color is more than just sunlight, because the rock can be different materials. It can have different valleys and shapes in it that cause different types of shadows. And so you have to be thinking about that rocks are not just round or oval circles or objects of one color. Like I mentioned, that pile of rocks on the upper part of the pond is going to be the most difficult. So pay attention to how I paint on that. I'm putting the darker color in down low and creating some delineation between the rocks. And then look what I'm just doing right there, putting a little line of shadow above it. So now it creates, again, it's starting to help create the illusion of multiple rocks there. Here in a moment, I'm going to be bringing in some titanium white, or I think it's tempered down a little bit with some of the yellow ochre. But even if it's not, see, you can just take that titanium white and just start applying it right next to your darker color, and it naturally starts mixing in and getting darker. So there, looked like I did have just titanium white on the brush, and it's creating that sunny side of the rock, and I'll keep massaging those rocks. But so I'm using that 3-color method. And see, just those little brush strokes of now on that big rock have created some randomness to it. Now I'm bringing in straight titanium white and doing the same thing with this rock. I'm allowing a little bit of that titanium white to have my brush to naturally mix in with the gray and then create a more natural look and transition. Again, not blending, but allowing the colors to mix on the rock, on the palette, on the painting as I apply. Again, I'll be coming in with titanium white and applying it right into that wet color on top of those rocks, and see how it's just naturally reshaping and providing contour and color and contrast to those rocks, rather than trying to see. I like that last stroke, put that dark in there, and allows the paint to just make color and make texture, allowing it to be a tool rather than just a medium. It becomes a tool itself, the paint does. So in impasto methods, I like to think of the paint as a part of my toolkit. It's not just a medium. It becomes a living part of the painting. And see, now I'm starting to create some separation up there in that pile of rocks by going in with that titanium white, just with small bits of it on my brush, able to create shadows and highlights and the effects. And see how that rock's now shaping out and becoming multiple rocks. And I'm not blending, I'm not mixing, I'm allowing those colors to just naturally come together and separate, and don't want to ever overdo it. Overdoing it creates mud. So you don't want a muddy rock. You want a natural, pretty looking rock. It can have mud on it, I guess, but don't. So with this method, I do take a few stabs at it, and it's not in danger of causing a mess, because of the impasto approach allows that paint just to settle on top of the other paint. So I keep going back in and working at it and reworking it until I get the kind of look I'm after. So searching for that look. I'm going to leave that alone, and I move on to another spot because I was just wearing out my welcome up there. Coming in and doing some more touch-ups on the rocks. I'm trying to bring in, I think at this point, another color into the rocks. Yeah, you can see it slightly there, slightly orangish, reddish hue I'm bringing into the side of those rocks. Just barely make it out, but it is a slight variation on the color of the rocks, which is a pretty addition and creates some natural look to it. And now I'm going to bring in another color to the rocks as well to make them more dynamic. And this is a lighter value, again, to help me create that separation up on that pile. You start to see that separation begin to happen. I believe this is sort of a beige mixture that I'm bringing in, probably made from some burnt sienna, yellow ochre, titanium white. It creates, again, contour and variety within the rock faces themselves. Still massaging the rocks, I come back, I think this is straight titanium white again, to create contrast, separation of those rocks. And again, it mixes right in with the colors, so I don't have to be too concerned about it overwhelming because it's straight titanium white. And I came back in and painted some of that out with the darker stuff. I'm still trying to massage them. I get close and then I don't know, I go back in and change it. That's part of the process with rocks. You just kind of got to mess around with them sometimes, unless you just want all your rocks to always look the same. I'm coming in with some of that darker color again to bring out the shadows a little better again, since I've mucked around with my rocks. And see, that helped quite a bit. I'm going to apply that shadow color to these other rocks as well. Since I've fiddled with the rocks, I've kind of wiped that dark away. So come back in, reconstitute some of the darks. And they're shaping up. Again, letting that color mix right on the canvas as I pull it around. Not creating mud because I've got just the right amount of paint on there, both on the canvas and on the brush. Came in there with some darker colors on that big rock. I'm keeping the video slow here so you can see me develop out these rocks because it's a process. It's a process. I'm working on them until I get one that feels right. And it's not always done with just a couple brush strokes, at least not by me anyway. I'll know the rock when I see it. Now here you're going to see me bring in just a little bit of ultramarine blue that's been turned a little grayish, but you can still see the blue hues in that as well. And come back in with a little more blue and you can really see it now. But it's just a nice complement to that big rock that's right up front, is to have that little bit of blue in it. And I think I try to tap in a little blue on a couple of these other rocks just to provide some highlights. Yeah, but try not to let it show too much. Don't want to go too much. So after finishing the rocks, I go back in to the rock pile at the top of the pond and make sure my brush strokes and my ground cover looks good around there. And I go around and check to make sure that I've got, a good randomness of patterns and I don't have any patches that are too small or too large, and fix some brush strokes that I see that I'm not quite happy with. So it's an opportunity to clean all that up before I move on to the fence posts. So on these fence posts, I start in with a gray. They're weathered from being outside. A lot of fence posts on a farm or a ranch, so these wooden ones, man, they could be 20 years old before, for that to be replaced. So they've been out in a lot of weather, 4 seasons, and hot and cold. And so they're grayed, they're bleached out. And so I'm putting some dark along the backside where the sun would be. And just kind of make them rough and raggedy looking is what I'm after here. So not creating any straight lines. And I'm not overly concerned about brush strokes when I'm doing an item like this. Just is about getting the good feel of the color up and down the fence posts. So while I'm still using a liberal amount of paint, I'm more concerned with the look and feel of it than I am particular brush strokes, because this is such a small object I'm painting. I think now I'm going to bring in some light colors. Oh, some patches of dark even. Yeah, and those do look nice. There will be dark patches in them. And some of these fence posts too, you'll when you're out, if you ever get a chance to go out and really roam the country where these old fences are, some of them will be burned. I know we have fires out here in Idaho where I'm at, and you'll come across fence posts that are blackened on one side because of, a prairie fire or such. Now I'm bringing in some of that light, probably went right into titanium white, just like I did on the rocks, to kind of bring that in, and then allow the brush and the paint to just mix it right there on the canvas. Again, not trying to blend, but trying to create contour, texture, randomness, a natural look of a weathered old fence post. And to the other fence post, doing the same thing with that lighter gray to the sunny side. And now I'm going right in with titanium white to begin to add more bleached out look to that fence post, and then let those colors bleed together, not mix together, more or less bleed together. It's kind of like doing rocks, except you do have the grain of the wood that's going to go up and down that you want to try to mimic and take advantage of. I think I'm going to come in with some more dark on top of that fence post up top, because I don't like it, or at least I should. If not, I will go back and fix it because it looks bad here. Here we go. Add a little darker there to that top fence post. Again, I'm going to keep this at regular motion, and so you can see me work on these fence posts and get a feel for how I do it. I really like the fence post down by the water right now. That looks pretty good. At least it does on the video. In real life, while I was painting, it might have looked bad and I might have wiped it out again. So again, I am fiddling until I get a look that I like. And it's not an exact science. It's this approach is not a single brushstroke type thing. It's not kind of the look I'm after. Adding a little bit more darker colors to that fence post there. Definitely, that bottom fence post looks really good. Top one's looking better. And fence post color is going to work good on this big rock, so I'm going to bring some of that over to the rock and create some variety in that. Now I'm going to zoom in close so you can see the brushwork. That's the lower part of the pond and those first rocks. See that orange, the colors I'm getting in there, that blue, and I look at the brush strokes around the ground and how this is up to the focal area. See, so they're smaller, and where up in the block in for the trees, I'm not worried about brush strokes yet. I'm just worried about blocking it in. But now you come down, you can see the longer strokes. I'm further away from the focal point. There's my rocks. Those look pretty good. And the shoreline, and see how the brush strokes are some randomness, but yet order to them in that they're pointing us in a direction down towards the water. But that's a good look at the brush strokes. Now I'm applying it. Got to get to those trees next, I think. So I'm moving on to the trees now, and I've mixed up about 4 or 5 colors that are going to make good tree colors, potentially. I end up having to bring in another color, but they're all based on a little bit of yellow ochre and burnt sienna, and of course I bring in some titanium white, bring in a little bit of ultramarine blue, and a little bit of cadmium yellow, medium, and light to make different hues around the same color. Just want to make some little differences in it, but I didn't want them all to be just the various, I didn't want them to all to be just mixed
from just titanium white to make the different ones. So I did bring in some extra little colors to put a little pizzazz in those trees, because those tree trunks are in the focal area, and so they're important. So you'll see some dark colors I'm putting on the shadow side, and some light colors I'll be putting on the sunny side. And I'll work those out, spend a little bit of time, nice small brush strokes, allowing the colors to mix on the canvas as I put the color down. For the sake of time and to keep the video from going too long, I've sped it up to a little bit more. But you can still see the technique. I'm just bringing in that color, laying it on there. I'm loading that brush pretty well. And now I'm bringing in those lights, as you can see, to on the sunny side. And I'm working carefully, using a smaller brush to make sure I lay that paint right in there and make some nice branches there. I wanted that tree to be gnarly. I wanted it to show the limbs down low. I just didn't want to make it a bush sticking on the end of a stick growing out of the ground. All right, so you want to be careful of these. I'm adding in a few extra little branches. There's a branch that just kind of goes nowhere. Broke off maybe. I'm finishing up the other branches. And just using those, 4 or 5 colors I made up from light to dark to build out this tree. So, while I work on this, I like vibrant colors, and I know the real world is not as vibrant as I typically paint. I can't help it. That's how I feel about the world. That's how I see the world. It's just a magnificent, magnificent place, a beautiful creation, and so the world feels brighter than it looks to me, and I know that seems a little bit mushy maybe, but yeah, that's how I look. I have a lot of gratefulness in the world that I live in and where I live, and so when I look out and see, and I'll show you some as the weather breaks, it starts warming up. I'll get some nice videos or nice photos from the mountains around here, and you'll see that under the right light, these colors aren't that far off. The sun can really lay out some beautiful, beautiful colors when it hits the hills just right around where I live. So it's remarkable. Now, after I get done with these trunks, I am going to find other uses for these colors. As always, I don't want to just use them in one place more than the trees, so I am going to find some other uses for these colors. And pretty soon I'll be starting on the greenery in the trees itself. So I'm liking how these tree trunks are turning out. They've got a nice look to them, a nice look, randomness, but yet the uniformity of a tree trunk. So it's pretty neat. I'm going to add another feature to this painting. I think it's going to be coming up here in just a minute. I'm going to take this color from the trees, and I'm going to create some drier mud or drier dirt that creeps up the shoreline a little bit, taking out some of that yellow ochre type colors, just to add some variety to the painting. So I'm taking that color, that tree color, and just moving it up the shore a little bit in a few places to create some more randomness. And then I'm going to add in that new feature I was just mentioning. I'm going to put a trail coming down to the pond right here. I'm starting on it now, where, there's always trails that come down to these ponds where the cattle will just habitually often follow that same trail down to the pond, and that's where they'll drink. Maybe the water's more shallow there, so they can step out into it better, a little safer there for whatever reason. Maybe that's just the direction they come from. Because of that fence, so they get funneled in that way. Or maybe there's multiple other places they hit that pond. They're just not visible. But so I'm going to use that tree color to build out some drier dirt that's
again, it's not wet, so it's going to be a little different color. So I'm going to create a little trail that goes up that hill. So I'm using small random brush strokes without any direction. They're going this and that way. It's a dirt trail, so there would be no uniformity to it. After just years of probably the cattle coming down that hill, full of hoof prints and pock marks and runoff from snow or rains or whatever may have cut a little gouge in there or whatever. And so at the bottom, I'm going to bring up some more mud there, bring in some darker stuff to kind of give the appearance. Maybe there was an animal, maybe there was a cow there not too long ago, so the water's a little muddier there, or the dirt's got a little more moisture or mud in it. So I'm going to fit around with that a little bit and create that trail. I think it's a good added feature, practical, and belongs there. And then I'm going to bring in some gray and put another rock in on this side of the trail. It creates depth to the painting, having a rock here on this side of the trail. So you see the rock, and then the trail is obviously on the other side of it. So that creates a natural depth to the painting. So in the process, I'm going to come in and do this rock pretty much like the others. And in the process, I just can't help it, I'm going to touch up a couple other rocks while I'm at it. As with the other rocks, I brought in a little bit of titanium white and tapped it into the fresh gray paint I put down there. And you see me do that there. It gives it a nice sunny highlight to one side. Maybe that side's been bleached out by years of being in the sun or something like that. So yeah, and I go ahead and bring some of that color over. Yeah, it's got a little bit of the brown in it from the dirt as well, and touch up some of these rocks. Just couldn't help it. Got to quit fiddling though sometime, but probably done with these rocks, I think, at this point. So the next step is to put the leaves on the trees, and I start with the darkest green and go on the shaded side of the trees, and that's where I get started. This darkest green, the best dark green I think you can make really fast and easy, anybody can do it, is ultramarine blue and your yellow ochre. You mix a fair, even amount of that together, and you're going to get a really nice dark green. And you can darken it up more by adding in more the ultramarine blue. You can make it darker and lean it more towards a bluish green as well. You can make it darker by adding in, I do keep a little bit of ivory black around if I want to go darker still. In this case, I did not use any ivory black at all. I don't use a lot of it. I try not to, but sometimes it's just faster and easier. It's what I call a cheat color. You have it, and you can take shortcuts with it. It's great for making different hues of gray, different variations and values of gray by mixing it in with their titanium white. So that dark color, it almost looks brown on my video when I'm looking at it, I put in is burnt sienna. And I thought I wanted some brown in the trees to give them some more variety. And I ended up getting rid of most of it. It just was not working for me. It wasn't giving me the look I was after. So I thought the trees looked better without it after I did it. Now, some of them might be showing through, but not a lot. You see me going in here with some of those lighter greens that I created, covering the sunny side of the tree, and then also putting some randomly around the tree, so it looks like there's parts of the tree that's getting some or partial sunlight. I don't want to make them uniform. It's, again, I'm not painting an apple. I'm painting trees, and the leaves catch the sunlight in various different ways. More sunlight's caught on the sunny side, and that doesn't mean, though, that there's not going to be some sunlight caught on the shadow side of the tree. So you see me work with those a little bit, putting in various hues of that green there. I think I've got, like I said, 4 or 5 different hues of green that I'm using there. I'm going to leave the big tree in the middle for last because I want to be able to put the light greens on this bush on that side, on the left side of the tree, so that they have a value transition against the dark that I'm going to put on the dark side of the big tree. So that contrast there is what I'm after. So I'm going to go with a lighter green as I come around to the sunny side of the bush, and then I'm going to bump that up against a dark green that's going to be on the back side of that tree. So contrast is everything. Sometimes you want to lose edges, and sometimes you want to make them more prominent. I didn't want these to bleed together too much. I'm going to go ahead and speed up these trees as I near completing them. But watch the brush strokes. Now, the brush strokes in these trees are more random again still than what's on the ground. The ground's brush strokes were meant to supplement or add to or help with the contouring of the ground sloping down to the pond and to give direction. Where the brush strokes in the trees are to be random, like leaves would grow. So they're going to be coming in from various different directions, various lengths, long ones, short ones, skinny ones, fat ones, from all different directions, so that it creates a nice random looking pattern in the tree. You also notice, and I mentioned it earlier in the video, that I left some like sky holes in my trees, and I'm going ahead and I'm leaving those in place, painting in over a little bit on the edges just to finish the edges off of them. But you'll see them. You still see 3 in the middle one. I think there's one on the one on the left there. So again, I keep massaging the trees using this impasto approach. Part of it is applying new paint on top of the paint that's already there, wet on wet, and having that full loaded brush so it can leave paint. And then you can create some blending, not a smooth blend, but a mottled blend by using less paint, like I'm doing here on the trees. You'll see some of those strokes are being mottled, and some of them are covering completely. And so I'm after that randomness there. You can't go wrong with trees if you just let go and let the randomness of your paint and brush work shine through. So the brush strokes that I used on the ground around that area, the smaller brush strokes giving the illusion of more care and detail. And then the brush strokes around the pond and up that trail and the fence, all of that allows me to be a lot more free in the trees. I don't have to overwork the trees as far as making them, they're trees. You don't have to focus on them to understand what they are. But your eye is going to be drawn to the, not the treetops themselves probably, but more towards the trunks of the trees and then up to the leaves and then back down again and around the pond. So I've decided that the dirt around the pond where that trail comes down needs to be a little wider. Usually it's more than one cow coming down for a drink. And so they'll widen it out as they get closer to the water's edge. So I'm adding a little more dry dirt around that spot. And I'm going to put some lighter colors as highlights in that dirt as well here in a moment. Don't want the dirt to be too solidly colored. There's going to be various rocks and clumps of dirt that dry out faster than others. So I'm going to create that illusion. I'm going to move now to the shadows of the trees and the fence posts and some small shadows near the rocks. And those are critical, I believe, for creating this landscape. You've got to show that light. And the trick with shadows is they're not so much gray or black as they are a darker color of what's there, because there's less light making it darker. So especially on a bright sunny day like this that we're having here in this painting, so the shadows have to be a lighter or a darker color of what's on the ground. So if you have any of that ground color left, you can darken that up a little bit. Mix in some darker colors, maybe ultramarine blue or ivory black if you have that.
I think I ended up using some of the color from the tree itself because it seemed to fit well. And then as I put it down, I maybe mixed a little bit with um, with the ground cover colors as well. But that gives the light a shadow effect. You'll also want to make sure your shadows are all leaning in the same direction. And you can use your brush handle to kind of measure that angle to make sure that they're all lining up the same way, as far as the sun should be cutting across those tree trunks at the same angle as they are across those fence posts. So all those should be pointing in the same direction, those shadows, and as well as the edges of the rocks. Whatever else you're shadowing, just you want to do it with the idea that the shadow they have to be running parallel to one another um, in some ways, especially when you're dealing with tree trunks and fence posts and straight up and down things. You've got a little extra care there. It's get a little looser when you get to the tops of trees or these bushes, because it's the shadow actually helps create the illusion of depth, because we don't know for sure how thick those trees and bushes are, as far as the distance between the front of it to the back of it from where we're standing. So we don't know how wide that shadow is. Is it it's an assumption to believe it's perfectly round. But anyway, so the trunks and the fence posts are the most important shadows to get right. Another thing to keep in mind when you're doing your shadows is the length of the shadow. How tall is the object casting the shadow, and at what angle is the sun coming from? And that needs to be consistent throughout your painting as well, so that you maintain realism. Because the eye, even though maybe the eye doesn't recognize exactly what the problem is, the mind will detect a problem, and some observers won't know why it's disturbing, and others will see that the shadows are not lined up and in sync as far as their length. So you'll see me measure the height of the objects, the height of the fence posts with my brush handle, and then compare that to the trees and the bushes and the rocks, and trying to judge based off of that where other shadows should be cast to make sure they're kind of lining up. I did the shadows, based on observational skills that I have, but I then measure them to follow up to see how close I am, and I think I captured the angles. Spatial relations is a handy skill to have. So this fence post next to the water, I have to use a different color. Obviously, we've got that burnt sienna and values of that. And so I had to make that a little darker. Once I get to the water, I will put a shadow into the water and start working on reflections and such. So I'm working on the rocks to get their little shadows in place. They're small, but it's important. The eye will pick up on it. The observer may notice if you don't get all the shadows in. So you see there, I measured with the brush handle. I measured the length of that shadow on the fence post. The rock is a little bit shorter. What's showing is, so the shadow casting would be sort of same. So I'm measuring both directions, kind of get an idea, and to compensate, shortening it up. And so that's what I'm talking about there in that measurement. And that's an important part of it there. I'm measuring that tree and measuring the shadow and seeing if I need to adjust that a little bit. And these types of proportional things are important, even when you're not doing like ultra realism. You still want to take those simple things in mind when you're painting. Now in this part, I'm going to come in and start putting in some greenery, some green grasses, patch of green grasses to break up this hillside. And I'm using a very dark green, again, based off of ultramarine blue and yellow ochre. And you could darken it. I may have darkened it up a little bit with ivory black. But these are just random structures of grass I'm putting out here, little patches of grass. So I'm going to put several of those around the shoreline here, and it breaks up that ground cover. And you'll notice I'm putting it right on top of my ground, all that yellow ochre mixing that I did. And so I'm using a light touch. You got to load your brush up nice and heavy with that green. Make sure it's of the consistency so it lays on top of that paint you've already got there. You may notice that I'm also coming in with a lighter shade or lighter hue of green with a little bit of yellows in it. I think I put in a little cad yellow light and maybe even a little cad yellow medium just to brighten that up. And I'm showing you here, I'm bringing in this violet, which I use occasionally. I don't use very much. You can tell that's a very full tube. I just use a speck of that. I'm going to use that to put in some violet flowers and things about these grass patches. I will also be putting in a little bit of yellow, cad yellow medium and cad yellow light for little highlights and flowers as well. And I'll come back in with some of that violet. Now, I did not put these patches of greenery in my sketches, nor block it in. I want, for this type of ground cover, I want to wait until I'm further along in my painting so that I can identify the best places to place these grass patches so they augment the composition. They create a greater visual effect. You could try to plan it in early in your sketches, but I find it's just better to get to this point and then just start bringing in these patches of greenery once I can better see the painting come to life. So let's review how I put these grass patches in. After I identify my location, I come in with the dark green and lay that out in a pleasing pattern on the ground. You have to load up your brush well enough with the right consistency of paint to make sure it stays on your ground cover coloring. Then I come in with some yellow based green or sometimes even with a small bit of cad medium or cad yellow light and just tap it across the top of it to lighten up that green, give it some variation in the color. You can see me doing it now, coming with a lighter green with yellows in it to lighten up those grass patches, make them less uniform. And then I come back in after I've worked on that pattern a little bit with some, here I got some yellow I'm coming in, probably straight yellow, cad yellow light. And I'll spread that around a little bit to, again, bring in some light patches and colors and such. Then I can come in and just spec in some little flowers, if you want. You can. I think I did cad yellow medium, and I put a few little violet flowers in there. There you go. See the violet flowers. Just something to break it up and add a little bit of color. And so that's pretty much the process. And I go around and I can put those in several different places, making these little patches of greenery that just add life to my painting. Really simple process. Dark green, then come in with some yellow or yellow, very bright yellow green, and blend that in, or carefully just tap that into the color. Right there, you see me doing it again to bring out some variation in the grass patch, lighten it up a little bit, make it have the right value to fit into the landscape. So I'm altering the value with those lighter yellows, and then bring in some little flowers and highlight it. I just do that wherever I think I need it. And I'm putting the final touches on here. For this patch of grass, I'll probably come in and do some more grass as I move along through the painting. It's time to start on the sky. I want to bring a more vibrant light blue into it. And I don't have a lot of sky, so I'm not going to try to do anything fancy and then put clouds in. I think it just detract when you have a little bit of sky like this. So I'm just going to paint it all pretty much the same color across the panel.
I'm going to take my time though on the sky around those edges. I want to keep the color pure, and I want to make sure I get up to the edges of those distant trees and the near trees and bushes to fill it in carefully. And also I'm going to make sure that my brush strokes are look nice and are in a good final state for the sky. And those brush strokes will be a little longer in the sky. Not as much paint as I put down in the ground layer, but still I have enough paint to show those brush strokes well. But make sure those brush strokes in the sky are still randomized. You don't want them all going the same direction and exactly the same length or any of that. You'll want to mix that up for a random look that's going to make the viewer feel comfortable about the sky and enjoy the randomness of the textures of the brush strokes. And once I'm done with the sky, I'm going to move down and use that same color to repaint the water. And the water is basically a reflection of the sky, its base color, so I'm going to pull that in. And once I get that done, I can start working on shadows and the water ripples and movements, and eventually get to cattails and lily pads and water lilies floating around out there, and just focus on a beautiful little pond. For the sake of time, I've really sped up this video very fast at this point so that we can get through it quick. Not a lot of skill here, just getting the job done. I'm going to take the same care around the edge of the pond that I did with the sky up against the trees and such. I want to be careful to not mix in too much color. It's not as bad here to bring in a little color from the shoreline as it would be natural to see some of the same colors in the water itself that are on the shoreline. But still, I don't want to bring in too much. So I'm going to be careful around the edges, just like I did in the sky. So now I'm going to start working on this water, putting in some various colors. I'm putting a little darker color in the bottom right. That's where the cattails are going to be, so the water would naturally be darker where the cattails are growing out. I talked a little bit about that in my last video. That's where, because of the roots of the cattails, you'll get more debris built up there, more mud lingering, because there won't be as much of a current going through there. You know, even in these ponds, you get a little bit of current from the warming and cooling of the water surface, and that just doesn't happen as much in those areas. So, and you'll get more movement of like fish in those areas. Often that's where they'll hide during the day and the heat of the day. I brought that same or a slightly lighter color variation of that into the pond in the upper right where the lily pads would go for much of the same reason. The water should be a little darker there because of the shadow of the lily pads, just like at the bottom, the shadow because of the cattails as well adds to that. I'm bringing in a green similar to what I have on those far trees up top to show a reflection as well. And now I'm bringing in a darker green to show the reflection of that bush that's just out of the water there. And I'll continue with that green to show the reflection of the trees in the water. I will also bring in a lighter, more yellowish green to represent the lighter shades of those trees. I'm using this side-to-side brushing technique to make it look more like a reflection on the water, to give it a hazy reflection look. You don't want it to be too precise unless it's extremely calm water. I'm going to go ahead and speed the video up at this point as I go ahead and paint in more of that reflection for those trees. Not worried about that fence post yet. I'll come back and catch that. But you can see me adding variation to the color, bringing in some darker, bringing in some more yellowish greens as well to try to create a more accurate reflection. I don't want to worry about it too much, but do want some accuracy to it. Now I've moved closer to the shoreline. I want to get that burnt sienna look reflected out in the water. Again, using the side-to-side strokes to create a slightly moving reflection. So I want to catch that all the way around the shore where it's appropriate. And I've thinned that, softened that burnt sienna down with titanium white, and being careful to just to bring in a little bit of that color on top. I still want to see the blue through that. Again, I will speed things up to move that part along. It's careful, again, not to put too much color in. On these bright days, you don't, sometimes the sun will wash out some of the color that's reflected and won't be quite as strong, depending on the angle of the sun, which is pretty high right now and coming across the sideways to the pond. So it would soften some of those colors more so than other angles of the sun. I wanted to get those reflections close to the shore done, but I'm still going to come back in and work on these trees some more. Those reflections aren't done yet. I want to bring in and soften the edges of the shadows of those trees. And so I'm coming crossways through that color with a pretty dry brush, just trying to get some waviness to the color of the trees. Again, slightly. I don't want a really heavy wavy water surface. So just allowing that brush to just kind of create waves and variations. I'm also going to pull it towards me here, which is adds to the reflection. There's usually a part of that reflection that gets pulled towards you in the water. So softening that up, and again working the side-to-side motion to create kind of a waviness in those colors and take out any harsh lines or areas where the trees are too dark. So I'll work across those shadows like that. And you can really easily overwork this. So you'll have to stop doing this type of thing before you think you're done, or you won't ever finish, and it'll just get muddied up and worse. Because this is probably one of the trickiest parts of this painting, because I'm using a different method where I don't have as much paint. This is where you can easily create mud in your water.
And once you have that mud, you have to scrape off the paint you've got there as much as you can, put down the blue again, and start all over. And try not to make mud the second time. Now, I could have used the same impasto method even in the water here with thicker paint and laying it on there and allowing the variations in the brush strokes of that thicker paint to create the illusions of water and such, which I've done in the past. I just felt for this painting I didn't want to. I wanted the contrast in the styling, I think, to make this water pop a little differently. So I was looking for the contrast of it. Didn't want to overload it with, that one method through the entire painting. Although that, like I said, that could be a valid approach. It's just I didn't feel like I wanted to do that for this water. So I'm showing you this method, this technique, and it's going to take a while. And I'm going to have to come back in a couple times and address it more as I build out colors and shapes and such. I'm going to move away from the water now and put in that fence post. I've got to put shadows and reflections of that fence post in. So I'm starting with a very light gray to block it in, and being careful not to make it, keep the height proper, because the base of it is submerged in water. So I'm going to bring several variations of grays in there. Basically, I'm using my ivory black and white titanium to mix several different colors of grays for the fence post to give it that weathered look. And I'm going to use some of those same grays to put the shadow in for this fence post. And so I'm going to start working on the shadow at the same time I work on the post to create that reflection back and forth. And I'm also going to put in the reflection for the post near the water, just on the edge a little bit. And there I go with that post. And so now I start putting that reflection in, bringing it towards us, trying to use the same colors. And when I put a color on the fence post, I will come down and put a color in the water. By working back and forth between the actual post and its reflection, it helps me keep that reflection lined up well with the colors and the shapes. They're so near to each other. When you're doing a shadow that's so near to one another, you have to put a little more care into it than you do, say, those trees, which are farther away. And so it's more difficult for the mind to make a comparison and say, oh, it's not quite right. But here, if you can make it look close, then you can get a beautiful effect that's really comfortable for the mind's eye to see, and it really enhances the reflection look that you're after. I think already the pond is looking better just putting it in the reflection of that fence post. And to break up that reflection, I do that back and forth just lightly, just to create that illusion of the water movement. This is where I come back in with some darker greens into my reflections. And I think this is a valuable lesson that I'm going to say this, and hopefully it's something you already know or you've been told and just hasn't sunk in yet. But sometimes you just have to leave a spot alone and before it's done, so that you can refresh your mind's eye, move on to something else, and then come back when you feel confident in what you're doing again. And that's kind of what happened in this water. I knew it was looking good, it was going the right direction, but I knew it wasn't quite right yet. And so now I'm coming back in with darker colors to make that reflection darker. And you can see now that it's breaking that color up nicely because I'm not going in solid with those darker colors. So I'm getting a nicer effect even yet still. So, don't overwork an area, stop, because you can come back. Never think you have to finish the spot right now. Now I'm moving over to the shadow of that fence post on the water. So I'm going to come in with some various colors, darker, grayish colors to kind of make that shadow. It's a difficult balance because I want the blues to be there, and I want the grays to be there. I want the greens to be there in order to create that shadow. And I'm going to use that same color to put reflections and shadows on the rocks. So now I'm working on rock reflections, bringing that grayish color down from the rocks, just pulling it down away from the rocks until I get a nice gray reflection in the water. Now I bounce over to the reflections for the trees again. See, I'm putting in a lighter yellowish green to reflect the sunny side of the tree. I'm mixing in a little darker shade of that here and there, using those sideways strokes to break up the edges of that reflection, and going in where the bush would be as well, massaging that back and forth to get that appearance of the shadow. Now I'm kind of blending a little bit together. This is the most blending I do, and I don't like it, but it's needed for this style. And coming in with some darkers now to kind of blend over and create some movement between the yellowish green that I put in on the edges and make a subtle transition over to the darker greens as well. I'm allowing that to break up a little bit. I don't want to create any solid colors as part of this process of building out these reflections. At least not in this painting, because my tree is clearly multiple shades of greens with yellows in it. You can see throwing in a little bit of darker greens here and there just adds, it adds depth to the reflection and creates the illusion of water ripples, ever so slightly. I want to keep the ripples small as it's just slightest of breezes. And now I'm coming back in over where the reflection of those distant trees, adding just a little bit of color there, Again, want to keep the value of that area subdued compared to the value of the bush and tree reflection. I'm going back in to establish a little darker water around where the lily pads will be. I'm using a slightly darker value of the blue I used in the water to create ever so slight ripples or variations in the surface color of the water. Now for the barbed wire on the fence, I'm using this very thin dagger brush, and I'm tapping it into a grayish color, and then I'm just tapping that along where I need the barbed wire. It creates a jagged line that I think serves the purpose of the illusion of the barbs coming off that wire. I think the tricky part is keeping that line straight. I'm just doing this freehand. You may need to use some sort of straight edge. Just be careful not to touch your wet paint surface. If you can get the first length of barbed wire in straight, then you can use that visually to gauge where you put the second one by, running it parallel. So that second one gets a little easier after you get your first one in. Getting the right load on your brush is critical. If you get too much paint, you get globs instead of that wire look. And if you don't get enough paint, then you're not leaving any color. So it's better to go in with lesser paint and wish you had more, because then you can go in a second time and be more controlled about how you load your brush. Once you get a big glob on there, then you may end up, having to fix it and clean up, which is always harder than getting it right the first time. What I try to do is get a thin layer of the paint laid out on my palette with my palette knife, so there's a thin layer, so I can just tap into that thin layer. So just the end of the brush gets, just the end flat of the brush gets the paint on it, and then I can lay a nice clean line down. So smooth out that paint. So you've got a thin layer, not too thin. You'll get the hang of how thin you need that on your palette. So you can just tap that tip of the flat edge of that brush in there just to get the right amount of paint to make a nice clean line. Another thing to keep in mind, some places on your barbed wire may not be as prominent. They may not show up as well. Maybe you didn't have the same amount of paint on there, or maybe the values behind it, but that's okay. That's okay. As you look at a barbed wire fence in the real world, you may see the barbed wire in some places depending on the background or how the sun's hitting it, and others it'll be harder or more difficult to notice. And so having it be varied on your painting is not an unnatural look. So resist the urge to go back in with more paint and try again. While I do that, sometimes you can also run into problems by overfilling a barbed wire line and making it stand out obnoxiously. Now, when you bring that bottom line of barbed wire to the water, what you want to do is stop in a location where it looks like it would strike the surface of the water before it gets to the fence post, because that bottom string of barbed wire will enter the water before it gets to the post and connect to the post underwater. So make sure you don't keep the barbed wire going where it should hit the water. And ever so delicately, where that barbed wire does strike the water, I try to leave a little mark there, as if there's a little ripple right around that where the waves are lapping up so slightly against the barbed wire. A little extra color. Now, at the end of these submerged fence lines like this, you'll see the barbed wire go on down into the water at an angle where they converge on a large, typically a big old rock that they attach the barbed wire to, wrap it around a few times and tie it down so that post is more secure. Now, using a dark green that I've used on the trees, I start putting in those lily pads. I've seen ponds with very thick lily pads where they're just everywhere, clumped together so close you can't hardly tell the difference between where one pad starts and the other ends. And I've seen ponds with lily pads that are a little more loose. The important thing is randomization. And so I'm going with a little looser pattern here
and randomizing their locations and sizes and the direction they're pointing. Sometimes they will have they won't be perfectly round. They'll have a slit on one side or the other, or more locations depending on the pad. Yeah, use your imagination. Go out and study some lily pads, some images online, and until you get an idea of what you're looking for, and use that as a reference. I'm going to be shifting to a very small flat brush that I want to use to put in some floating lily flowers. I'm going to be using violet right out of the tube, and then I mix in a little bit of titanium white, and I'll start blocking them in with that light color, and then I'll come in once I get a good and a healthy amount of paint on there in the very light purple. Then I'll come in with straight purple right out of the tube. Then I can put highlights in with that and just let the paints flow together naturally. It's small, so you don't want to get too caught up in detail, but two colors really do it. So take the purple, lighten it down with titanium white, and then bring the purple right in on top of it and just tap it in. If you use enough paint, it mixes out pretty well, and you can massage that paint around and make a nice looking little lily floating in the water. And you don't always have to have flowers with your lily pads. I just like it. I think it's a nice feature. Adds another component of beauty, another way to get beautiful colors in. I also then go in with a lighter green and start making little leaves under those lilies, so that they're not just a lily alone on the water. I put a little bit of green under them, like a little leaf popping up under them. So right now my lily pads are one color of paint, and I come in with a couple of other values of green, both of them just a little bit lighter, and create some variety in the coloring of those lily pads, so they're not just flat and lifeless. So you'll see me tap in some various colors and maybe put some dark back on it if I get too much of the light, using a sizable amount of paint while I do it, and leaving some texture and brush strokes actually in how I am putting that paint on there. And I think it adds another layer of realism and variety and motion to the lily pads. Now, when I put in the cattails, I use a little dagger brush, and I'm just tapping that a couple times to make each cattail head, and I'm putting them in randomly. I try to don't make them all standing straight up and down. The real cattails don't do that. They'll lean and wobble from one direction to the other. So I'm just painting them in carefully with a darker brown. I still had some darker colors left over from doing the tree trunks, and so I think I just used one of those colors that I'd already mixed up back then. So the first step of the cattail was putting the heads in. Now I come back in with some cadmium yellow medium, just a little bit on the brush, and I start laying a little sliver of that on the edges of each of the cattail heads to give some reality, some life, some movement, more texture and depth to the shape and look of the cattail. So the next step on the cattail is to start putting the stems in. And I'm using that same dagger brush that I used to put in the barbed wire fencing. And I'm just slowly tapping in lines of that, a dark green, to create the stems. And you could also use a rigger if you wanted to. There's going to be a lot of color mixed in down here, so the precision of a rigger, in my mind, was not necessary, because I'm also going to come in and start putting in some leaves after I get the stalks in. I'm using a slightly brighter green to put the leaves in. They run up along the stalks and come out, and there could be some wayward ones just growing up without a stalk. Maybe the stalk broke off and the leaf is still there. So whatever, just put them along the stems of the stalks of the cattails, and
If you got a gap and you want to put one in, go ahead and put one in. I also want them to feel thicker than they are as far as the amount of vegetation growing up in there. So I'm going to come in with a darker green, as you see there, and put in some more leaves randomly. I think it looks cool when you bring some leaves up higher than the cattails themselves. Not too many, just spot them in here every once in a while. And then you can see me down at the bottom of the cattails. I'm putting in more dark green to kind of block out some of that blue, so it looks like they're thicker in there. The vegetation is thicker than it actually is. And with that same brush, I add some more delicate foliage around the water lilies growing there around the lily pads. And then back down to the cattails to put in some more dark green. It's good for the composition. I need some darker color down there, as well as helping the cattails appear more realistic and appealing. Now, using that same little brush, I'm going to start putting in some green on the grass and start putting in some grass growing up, sticking up more prominently, like next to that rock. And I do bring the rigger in and use that as well. So I'm bouncing back and forth, putting in some little violet flowers, and finding opportunities whenever I see to go in and add a little more color to those cattails. I think it really brought them out a little bit better. More color in there, more yellowish color. I think I went straight cadmium yellow light this time around to supplement those. And bring the rigger in to work on those grasses. Again, using various shades of green, the darker green like that I use to start, and then I start putting lighter greens in there, maybe some yellows. There's a really light color. Again, it's contrast. That's why I'm going next to these rocks to create that contrast. Now I'm putting a little bit of almost yellowish green on those lily pads as well. And I'm just moving around the painting, augmenting, improving each little spot of grass that I'm putting in. And you can get carried away with this and it can overwhelm your painting. You don't want to do too much of that. But yeah, it adds some color and some variety. So if you have a dead spot that's out in the middle and you just feel like, what do I do? You can move in with some nice greenery to break it up a little bit, and like I'm doing here. And some little flowers and such. That's a pretty simple process. You can practice this on cardboard if you not sure you want to go right into a painting with it. You can get a lot of practice done on cardboard using techniques there as well. Some darker green. So I just pull that out in like patches of greenery. And some little flowers. I don't do this in every painting. I just have around these ponds. It just felt really good around these ponds to put this kind of thing in. And these are supposed to be really cheery, bright, sunshiny, feel good, look good paintings. You'll see me switch between the rigger and then this flat dagger brush. And they both make grasses in their own way. So by mixing them, I get a little variety of grass looks. So don't all the grasses growing up look the same. So there's a few different methods I use to create grass when I'm doing this. So like I said, all the grasses don't look the same. One is I just use the dagger brush and I load it, like I explained earlier, a really thin layer of the paint on my canvas, or excuse me, on my palette, and I tap it in there, and then I just tap up and create the piece of grass. Another method I use with my rigger is, of course, I get the paint really thinned up with
my turpentine or such, cleaner like that, or whatever you'd use to thin down your paint a lot and get it really good and runny, I load that brush so I get a flat edge on it, and then I drag that up and create a very thin line of grass. Then the other method is I load up that brush, that rigger brush, and I lay it down on its side right where I want the grass to grow from, and I get a line of that color, and then I can take and I can drag, I can paint out of that. So I'm basically putting paint on my canvas with it laying down the rigger, and then I'm drawing up from it using the paint that's there. And then I can also draw down and sideways, and so it doesn't look all even, and put some variety in that. And then one other way I use the rigger is I load it up, I lay it on the side, and I just flick it upwards or in the direction I want the grass to grow. And I'll flick it up and I'll lay it and I flick it up, and it creates a broader, shorter clump of grass. And that's several methods I use with my rigger and that flat dagger brush to make grasses. And by combining all these types and methods, I create varying types of grass looks so that it doesn't all look like I just used a liner brush and just drew a bunch of lines. So it creates clumps of grass and individual slivers of grass. And then, of course, I come in with different values of the same colors, different greens or yellows or other relative colors I'm using for my grass. Now, that upper right shoreline, I put in that grass, tall grass. Now I'm going to put a patch of short grasses and flowers. All that's an eye stop so the eye doesn't drop off the edge of the painting over there. And I'll use the same technique I used on the other grass patches with the flowers and the grass and the various colors and such. And I'm going to drop in some white flowers and put a little speck of cadmium yellow medium in the center of them. Now I want to put some delicate ripples in the water, and I start with a flat brush, but decide very quickly I'm not going to be able to get the precision I want, so I switch to my palette knife. So on the palette knife, I just load up some very light blue on the edge of that palette knife, and then start tapping it on, making various lengths of lines, and do that all over the pond to make these little delicate ripples. Now you see one spot in the middle of the pond where the paint, the little blue paint up in there is a little thicker. So I'm taking a palette knife, I'm going to start working that, and I'm going to actually turn that into a circular ripple, as if a fish had come up and disturbed the surface of the water, maybe getting a bug or something like that, or just tapping the end of it with his nose. I end up using a combination of that small flat brush and a palette knife to create that ripple effect where the fish disturbed the surface of the water. Took a few shots at it, but in the end, I think the effect worked out pretty well. Broadened that ring a little bit, and that helped a lot. Satisfied with the ripple ring, I go back to adding a few more little waves or ripples in the water with the palette knife, filling in the gaps a little bit. Makes it look like a calm day, but yet still just the slightest of breezes creating little ripples. In the end, I think it turned out pretty well for a subtle looking pond surface. Just a few more little final touches and I will sign this painting, and then we can zoom in on it and take a closer look at the brushwork all around the painting. Let's take a final close-up look at this painting. I am so grateful that you watched through this video. Much appreciated. I hope you learned something. I hope you enjoyed it. I certainly enjoyed it. And for now, this is the Big Toad, and I am out.